It was Tuesday morning on September the 25th, 2019. Derek Hollis stood at the edge of his cornfield in Boone County, Iowa, and watched 6 years of precision farm and infrastructure go dark in the space of 45 seconds. The display screen on his Case YH-AFS Pro 700 terminal flickered twice, threw an error code he'd never seen before, and went to black. The auto steer disengaged with a soft mechanical click that sounded, in that moment, like something breaking that couldn't be fixed. Derek stood there with his hands on the steering wheel of a $380,000 combine and felt the harvest season, the most critical 9 days of his farming year, begin to come apart at the seams. He was 41 years old, and he had built his operation from 200 acres of rented ground into 1,800 acres of owned and leased farmland over 14 years of 7-day weeks and decisions that kept him up until 2 in the morning. He had GPS auto steer on every piece of equipment. He had variable rate application technology, yield mapping software, and a subscription to a satellite imagery service that cost him $4,200 a year. He had a farm management app on his phone that synced with his equipment in real time and sent him alerts when a machine's performance dropped below threshold. Derek Hollis was, by every measure his peers and his lender used, a modern farmer, a precision farmer. A man who had embraced every technological advantage the industry offered and built his operation around the assumption that those advantages would always be there when he needed them. He had never seriously considered what happened when they weren't. The problem, as his dealer's service technician explained over the phone 40 minutes later, was a regional GPS signal degradation event. A combination of atmospheric interference and what the technician carefully described as some issues with the satellite constellation geometry over central Iowa had knocked out reliable RTK correction signals across most of Boone, Story, and Hamilton counties. The technician told him it might clear up in a few hours. It might take a day or two. He couldn't say for certain. What he could say was that the auto steer system wouldn't function with the signal degraded below threshold, because operating at reduced accuracy could damage Derek's field drainage tile, could double apply or skip apply inputs in future passes, and could throw off the yield mapping data he'd spent 6 years accumulating. Derek thanked him and sat in the cab of his combine for a long moment, looking at a field of corn that was ready to come out of the ground right now, today, and thinking about what the forecast said. Rain was coming Thursday, not a drizzle. A 2-day event that would push moisture back up into the grain and potentially cost him a full point of dry down, which at his scale translated to somewhere between $18,000 and $24,000 in additional propane costs and drying time. He had a 9-day window, but he needed every hour of it. And his combine was sitting at the end of a row with a dark screen and no way to drive a straight line. He tried to drive manually for the first hour. He really did. He made 3 passes down the field, fighting the wheel, watching the header wander off the row edges, feeling the unease of a man who has outsourced a skill so completely that he can no longer perform it under pressure. The rows were not catastrophically crooked, but they were crooked enough that his grain cart driver, a young man named Tyler who had worked for Derek for 3 seasons, stopped the tractor and cart at the end of the field and walked over to look at the combine tracks with an expression that said more than he was willing to out loud. Derek called his dealer again, where he called the AFS technical support line and spent 49 minutes on hold before reaching a specialist who walked him through a signal acquisition reset that did nothing. He called his neighbor to the south, Mike Franson, who had a John Deere 9700 with Starfire RTK and was experiencing the same problem. He called the agronomist who managed his precision AG program and got a voicemail. He sat in the cab and pulled up the farm management app on his phone. As if the app might offer a solution the app had no mechanism to provide. By 2 in the afternoon, he had harvested 47 acres of a field that needed to be done before Thursday, and he had done it in a way that made his field maps look like they'd been drawn by someone in a moving vehicle. That was when Tyler walked up to the cab window and said quietly that there was an old man at the end of the field road who'd been sitting in his truck for about 20 minutes, watching. Let me tell you about Raymond Kuba, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Raymond was 79 years old in the fall of 2019, and he had farmed the same 320 acres in the northwest corner of Boone County for 54 years. His father, Raymond Kuba, had broken that ground in 1931 with a team of horses and a borrowed plow, and had held on to it through the Depression by growing enough food to feed the family and selling enough hogs to make the land payment every year without exception. Emil had passed the farm to Raymond in 1965, when Raymond came back from 2 years in the Army with a bad knee and a deep and permanent appreciation for the specific silence of an Iowa morning. Raymond had farmed it ever since. He had never expanded beyond his original acreage. He had never taken on debt he couldn't service with one bad year's income. He had never bought a piece of equipment he didn't understand completely, and he had never sold a piece of equipment that still worked. His neighbors, including Derek Hollis, thought of Raymond Kuba the way people think of a fence post that's been in the ground so long it has become part of the landscape. He was there. He had always been there. He was quiet, and he did not complain, and he watched things with a patience that could make younger men uncomfortable because it implied a longer view of events than they were accustomed to considering. He had sold his cattle in 2004 and rented most of his ground to a young farmer by 2012, keeping only 80 acres in active production himself, which he farmed with equipment that his dealer had stopped stocking parts for before Derek Hollis had bought his first tractor. Raymond had watched the GPS situation develop across the county that morning with the attentiveness of a man who had been waiting, without impatience, for a specific kind of problem to arrive. He had listened to the conversations at the co-op. He had heard from his grandson, who worked at the Case YH dealership in Ames, that the signal degradation was widespread and that the service department was fielding calls from a dozen operations that had gone effectively blind in the middle of harvest. He had driven past Derek's field twice before he stopped, and he had watched the crooked combine tracks accumulating in the standing corn with the expression of a man watching a problem he knows how to solve. Let me tell you about what Raymond had in the bed of his truck, because it matters more than it looks like it should. He had a set of row markers, not GPS waypoints, not light bars, not an auto steer system with a subscription service and a satellite correction signal. He had physical row markers, tall fiberglass poles with bright orange flags on the ends, and a collection of hand-painted wooden lath stakes that his father Emil had used to mark field boundaries and row ends in the years before any electronic guidance existed. He had a 100-foot cloth measuring tape, a compass that had belonged to his father, and a notebook with a pencil tied to the cover with a piece of balin twine. He had been using variations of this system his entire farming life, not because he couldn't afford better, but because he had never found a reason to stop trusting something that worked every time, in every weather, under every condition, without a subscription fee or a satellite in the right position. He also had something that Raymond himself would have described, if pressed, as a working knowledge of the field. He had driven past Derek's operation enough times to know the layout. He knew the field was 127 acres in an irregular rectangle, with a slight dogleg in the southeast corner where the original survey line had accommodated a drainage ditch that had since been tiled and filled. He knew the road direction because he had watched Derek plant it in the spring. And he knew, because he had been farming this county for 54 years, exactly how to establish a reference line across that field that a man could follow with his eyes and his hands and get it right. Derek came down from the cab when Tyler told him the old man was walking toward the field. He stood at the end of the row with his arms crossed and watched Raymond Kuba come across the field road with his notebook and his orange-flagged poles and his cloth measuring tape. And Derek's first thought was not a charitable one. His second thought was not much better. Raymond was wearing bib overalls that had been washed so many times the blue had gone the color of a winter sky, and he was moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who has never once in his life been in a hurry he didn't put himself in. Derek said politely, but with the particular politeness that contains a dismissal inside it, that he appreciated Raymond stopping by, but that he had his dealer working on the signal issue and expected to have it resolved shortly. Raymond looked at the combine tracks in the field for a moment without speaking. Then he said he didn't think the signal was going to resolve before Thursday's rain. His grandson had told him the atmospheric interference was tied to a solar weather event and that the correction network wasn't expected to be fully operational for 36 to 48 hours. Derek said he had heard something similar. Raymond said he could set the field for him. He said he could establish a baseline and mark the row ends so that Derek could drive the field manually and hold a straight line without the auto steer. He said it would take him about 2 hours to walk the field and set the stakes, and that once it was done, Derek could run as fast as he wanted, and the rows would come out right. Derek looked at the orange-flagged poles. He looked at the cloth measuring tape. He looked at the notebook with the pencil tied to it with baling twine. And then he said something that he would spend the next several years wishing he could take back. He said, with a smile, that he meant to be friendly, but wasn't entirely, that he was sure Raymond's system had worked fine in its day, but that his field was GPS mapped to sub-inch accuracy, and that trying to replicate that with wooden stakes and a compass was a little bit like trying to replace a computer with an abacus. Raymond listened to this without any change in his expression. He looked at the dark screen on the combine for a moment. Then he said that sub-inch accuracy was a fine thing when the satellite was in the right place, and that a wooden stake was in the right place every single time because it didn't move unless you moved it. Derek's smile stayed on his face, but it had gotten smaller. He said he would think about it and let Raymond know. Raymond said that was fine, and that the rain was coming Thursday, and that he would be at home if Derek changed his mind. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone struggle with a problem you already knew how to solve and had to make the decision about whether to offer help a second time? Raymond Kuba drove back to his farm that afternoon and did not call Derek Hollis. He did not stop by again. Now, he went home and did what he always did in the evenings. He sat on the porch and watched the light change over his fields, and he waited, because Raymond Kuba understood that some men need to exhaust every modern option before they can accept an old solution. Derek called the AFS line again at 4 o'clock and was told the signal was still degraded. He called his dealer's service manager at home at 6 and was told the same thing. He spent the evening on a precision farming forum reading about other operators in the region who were dealing with identical problems, and he read several posts from farmers who were attempting to drive manually with mixed results. And he read one post from a farmer in Hamilton County who'd simply stopped harvesting and was waiting for the signal to come back, which Derek calculated would cost that man approximately $31,000 in delayed harvest if the rain came as forecast. He called Raymond Kuba at 7:43 in the evening and asked if the offer was still open. Raymond said it was. He said he would be there at 6 in the morning. Let me tell you about the next 2 hours of that Wednesday morning, because they are the reason this story is still being told at the co-op in Ogden every fall. Raymond arrived at the field at 5:52, 8 minutes before he said he would, in his 1987 Chevrolet pickup with the orange-flagged poles rattling in the bed. He had a thermos of coffee and his notebook and his father's compass in a leather case that had cracked along one edge and been repaired with a piece of electrical tape sometime in what looked like the previous decade. He did not ask Derek for anything. He walked the south edge of the field first, moving with that unhurried pace, and he paced off the distance to the first row end with a stride that Derek would later learn Raymond had measured against a surveyor's chain in 1971, and calibrated so precisely that his pace distances were accurate to within 18 inches over 1,000 feet. He made notes in his notebook. He consulted the compass twice. He drove a lath stake at the field corner with a rubber mallet he pulled from his back pocket, and he attached an orange flag to it, and he walked to the next position. Tyler watched from the grain cart tractor with the engine idling. He had his phone out, and he was not looking at it. He was watching Raymond Kuba walk the field with the same attention he might have given to watching someone perform a skill he had never seen before, which is exactly what it was. Derek watched from the cab of his combine. He had the engine running because he wanted to be ready to move the moment Raymond was finished, and partly because having the engine running gave him something to do with his hands. Raymond worked without rushing and without pausing. He set 14 stakes along the south headland and 14 corresponding stakes along the north headland, each one positioned to give Derek a sighting line down a set of rows. He then walked the field diagonally to check the alignment of his stakes against each other, making 2 small adjustments with the rubber mallet, tapping one stake 1/2 inch to the east and 1/3 of an inch to the west. He walked back to his truck, poured a cup of coffee from the thermos, drank it standing up looking at the field, and then walked over to Derek's combine and climbed up on the step to talk through the window. He said that the stakes on the south end were the approach markers. He said Derek should line up the left corner of his cab with the stake before he entered the row, and that as he drove north, he should pick up the corresponding stake on the north end and hold it at the same position in his windshield. He said the rows were 30-inch spacing, and that his stakes were set to the nearest row center, and that if Derek drove to the stake, he would be within 2 inches of where the auto-steer would have put him. He said 2 inches of drift in a 127-acre field was not going to hurt Derek's tile lines or his yield maps in any way that mattered. Derek looked at the stakes. He looked at the field. He said carefully, "How accurate do you think this actually is?" Raymond said he had been setting fields this way since 1969. He said his father had taught him the system, and that his father had learned it from the man who had surveyed the original township lines in that part of Boone County in 1903. He said the principle was older than GPS by about a century, and that it worked for the same reason GPS worked. It gave you a fixed reference point that didn't change while you were moving. He said the only difference was that his reference points were made of wood and fiberglass instead of radio waves, and that wood and fiberglass did not have atmospheric interference problems. Derek nodded. He put the combine in gear. He lined up the left corner of his cab with the first stake, the way Raymond had told him, picked up the north stake in his windshield, and drove the first row. It was straight, not approximately straight, not straight enough. Straight in the way that a line drawn with a ruler is straight, consistent, unwavering, holding its position across 2,600 feet of field with a precision that Derek could feel through the steering wheel as the machine tracked down the row without fighting him. He came out the north end and stopped and looked back down the row he had just cut, and Tyler was already out of the grain cart tractor, standing in the stubble, looking at the row with his hands on his hips. Tyler said something that the narrator of this story will decline to repeat verbatim, but which expressed in 2 short words a level of impressed disbelief that needed no elaboration. Derek drove the second row, then the third. Then he stopped counting and just drove, picking up each stake in sequence, holding the reference point in his windshield, feeling the combine move through the corn in rows that were as clean and true as anything his auto steer had ever produced. The header was taking the stalks cleanly. The grain was flowing into the tank without the skip and double-cut pattern that had plagued his manual attempts the day before. The field was coming apart in the way it was supposed to come apart, in straight, parallel swaths that would leave the residue distributed evenly, and the soil undisturbed in the way that 6 years of precision management had prepared it to be undisturbed. Raymond Kuba sat in his truck at the field road for 45 minutes, watching. Then he drove home. He did not stay to be thanked. He did not wait to see the field finished. He had set the stakes. Derek explained the system and confirmed that it was working, and that was the entirety of what he had come to do. Derek would finish that field by 8 o'clock that evening, 127 acres in a single day, every row straight, the yield monitor tracking normally, the grain tank filling on schedule. The rain came Thursday morning exactly as forecast. Derek's corn was out of the ground. Let me tell you about what happened the next morning, because this is the part of the story that Raymond Kuba's family still talks about. Derek drove to Raymond's farm at 7 in the morning with a check in his pocket. He had written the check for $500 the night before, then torn it up and written one for $1,000, then decided that felt insufficient and written one for $2,500, which was still less than 1 hour of the delay costs he would have absorbed if the field had sat through Thursday's rain. He knocked on Raymond's door, and Raymond answered it in his overalls with a cup of coffee in his hand and the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and was not particularly excited about it. Derek said he wanted to pay him for his time. Raymond said he didn't want to be paid. Derek said he had to do something. He said Raymond had saved his harvest and that he wanted Raymond to know he understood that. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside." He poured Derek a cup of coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Raymond's wife Lorraine set a plate of toast between them without being asked, and Raymond said what he had been thinking about since the day before. He said that the GPS system was a fine thing. He said he didn't want Derek to think he was against it, because he wasn't against anything that helped a man do his work better. But he said there was a principle underneath the GPS system and underneath his stake system and underneath every guidance system that had ever existed, and the principle was simply this: you need a fixed point that doesn't move, and you need to be able to see it. He said the satellite gave Derek a fixed point he couldn't see, and that when the satellite moved or the signal degraded, the fixed point disappeared. He said his stakes gave Derek a fixed point he could see with his own eyes, and that a thing you could see with your own eyes was never going to have an atmospheric interference problem. He said he wasn't telling Derek to stop using GPS. He said he was telling Derek to understand what the GPS was doing for him, so that when it stopped doing it, he would know what to do himself. Derek sat with that for a moment. Then he asked Raymond where he had learned to set a field that way. Raymond said his father had taught him. He said Emil had learned it from the county surveyor, a man named August Pfeiffer, who had been setting field lines in Boone County since before the First World War. He said August Pfeiffer had told Emil that the method went back further than that it was the same principle the Romans had used to lay out their roads, and that the Romans had learned it from someone before them. He said some things didn't become obsolete. They just waited for people to remember why they were built. Derek put the check on the table. Raymond looked at it without picking it up. He said he would donate it to the 4-H program at the county fair if Derek insisted on leaving it, because he didn't feel right taking money for something his father had taught him for free. Derek said that was fine. He left the check on the table and drove home, and that afternoon he called his precision agi consultant and had a conversation that the consultant described later as the most unusual call he had received in 11 years of doing the job. Derek asked him to put together a training session for his equipment operators on manual field guidance, on how to establish a baseline, how to set reference markers, how to drive a straight row without electronic assistance. The consultant said he wasn't sure he was the right person to teach that. Derek said he knew exactly the right person, and that he would make the arrangements. Raymond Kuba taught that session in November of 2019 in Derek's shop to Derek and Tyler and 2 other operators using a whiteboard and his notebook and his father's compass in the cracked leather case. He talked for 3 hours. He covered field geometry, baseline establishment, sighting technique, and the mathematics of row spacing across irregular field shapes. He brought the original lath stakes that Emil had made in the 1940s, painted white with a broad brush, the paint now yellowed and cracking, but the stakes themselves still straight and sound. He let each operator handle them. He let them feel the weight of the compass in its case. He talked about August Pfeiffer and about the township survey, and about the way the original field lines in Boone County had been established with a transit and a chain, and the patience of men who had no other option and therefore did it right. Tyler, who was 24 years old and had grown up with GPS in every vehicle he had ever operated, asked Raymond at the end of the session whether he thought the old methods were actually better than the new ones. Raymond thought about it for a moment. He said no, he didn't think they were better. He said the new methods were faster and more accurate under normal conditions, and that a man would be foolish to give them up. But he said better and more reliable were 2 different things. Yes, and that a method which worked 98% of the time and a method which worked 100% of the time were not the same method, regardless of which one was more accurate during the 98%. He said the goal wasn't to choose between old and new. The goal was to understand both well enough that you were never completely without options. Tyler wrote that down in his phone. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in Raymond's shop in November of 2019. Derek Hollis installed a set of manual guidance markers, fiberglass poles with orange flags, stored in a length of PVC pipe mounted to the wall of his equipment shed, on every farm he operated. He updated them every spring when he changed row direction or added new ground. And he trained every new operator he hired on the system before he put them on a GPS-equipped machine, on the theory that a person who understood the underlying principle would use the GPS better and panic less when it failed. His dealer's service manager heard about this and called Derek to ask about it. Derek explained the whole story, and the service manager was quiet for a moment and then said that was the most sensible thing he had heard a precision farmer say in a long time. Raymond Kuba died in March of 2022 at 81 years old, in the house his father had built on the farm his father had broken from prairie ground in 1931. His funeral was at the Lutheran Church in Ogden, and the parking lot was full in a way that surprised people who had not understood, until that moment, to how many people Raymond had quietly helped over the course of 54 years of farming the same 320 acres without making any noise about it. Derek Hollis was there. Tyler was there. The county surveyor was there, a younger man who had never met Raymond but had heard the story from someone who had, and who felt, for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate, that he owed the man a measure of respect. Raymond's son, David Kuba, inherited the farm and the equipment and the notebook and the compass in the cracked leather case. He also inherited the lath stakes his grandfather Emil had painted white in the 1940s, which were stored in a bundle in the corner of the old machine shed, wrapped in a piece of burlap, still straight, still sound. Let me tell you about what happened in the fall of 2024, and because some stories have to repeat themselves before people fully understand what they mean. Derek's son, Marcus Hollis, was 19 years old and had been running the grain cart for 2 seasons. He was not Derek. He was faster, more confident, and somewhat less inclined to call his father before making a decision. In late September of 2024, another GPS signal disruption hit central Iowa. This one was shorter, only about 14 hours, but it landed on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of a soybean harvest that Marcus was running largely on his own while Derek was at a land auction in Ames. Marcus called his father. Derek told him to call David Kuba. Marcus did not know David Kuba. He drove past the Kuba farm, saw the old equipment in the yard, saw the machine shed with the door open, and felt, in a way he recognized but couldn't name, it was like he had seen this situation before, which he had in the way that children absorb their parents' stories without knowing they have done so. David Kuba came out of the shed when he heard the truck. He was 52 years old and looked enough like Raymond that Marcus had a brief, disorienting moment of recognition. David listened to Marcus explain the problem. He went into the shed and came back with the bundle of lath stakes in their burlap wrapping and a set of orange-flagged fiberglass poles and a notebook that was newer than his father's, but had the same pencil tied to the cover with a piece of baling twine. Marcus looked at the stakes. He looked at the poles. He started to say something. David said quietly that he knew what Marcus was thinking, and that his father had heard the same thing once, and that it hadn't turned out the way the person saying it expected. Marcus closed his mouth. They drove to the field together. David walked the soybean ground with the same unhurried pace that Raymond had walked Derek's cornfield 5 years earlier, setting stakes with the rubber mallet, consulting the notebook, making 2 small adjustments. He talked Marcus through the sighting method. He handed him the compass and showed him how to verify the baseline. He explained the principle, the fixed point, the reference line, the thing you could see with your own eyes that would never have an atmospheric interference problem. Marcus ran the field, every row straight. The soybeans came out clean, the header tracking the rows the way it was supposed to track them. Yet the grain flowing into the tank without the wandering double cut that would have cost him yield and cost his father money, and cost both of them the kind of confidence that is harder to rebuild than a field map. When Marcus came out the last row and shut the combine down, David Kuba was still standing at the field road, watching. Marcus climbed down from the cab and walked over and shook David's hand and said, "I want to learn the whole system. I want to know everything your dad knew." David said he would teach him. He said there wasn't much to it, really. Just geometry and patience and a fixed point you could see. He said his grandfather, August Pfeiffer, had taught his grandfather Emil, and Emil had taught Raymond, and Raymond had taught him. And now he would teach Marcus. And the thing about a method that worked was that it kept finding people who needed it. He said his father used to say that some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. Marcus wrote that down in his phone. The lath stakes that Emil Kuba painted white in the 1940s are still in the machine shed on the Kuba farm in the northwest corner of Boone County. David keeps them wrapped in their burlap in the corner where Raymond kept them, and he checks them every spring the way Raymond checked them, and the way Emil checked them before that, running his hand along the length of each one, feeling for splits, tapping any that have gone soft at the base, replacing the ones that need replacing with new lath cut to the same length and painted the same white. And the compass in the cracked leather case sits on the workbench where Raymond left it, and the crack in the case has not been repaired beyond the piece of electrical tape that has been there since before David can remember. Precision ag consultants and GPS equipment dealers have been to that farm over the years, and every one of them has looked at the stakes in the corner and the compass on the bench and said something polite about the history of the place, and David has listened to them politely, and then the signal has gone down somewhere in the county and his phone has rung, and he has gone to the shed and taken down the bundle from the corner and driven out to whoever needed him. Some problems don't need more satellites. They need a fixed point you can see with your own eyes and the patience to walk a field and put it there. That's what Emil Kuba understood in 1931, and what Raymond understood every day of his 54 years on that ground, and what Marcus Hollis is beginning to understand now, standing at the end of a straight row in a field that the GPS said couldn't be run without it. That's what happens when knowledge is treated as something worth keeping. It doesn't disappear when the signal does. It waits in a bundle of white-painted lath in the corner of a machine shed, wrapped in burlap, still straight, still sound, ready for the next time someone needs to remember that the oldest guidance system in the world is a line you draw yourself between 2 points. You can